Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 18th of November 2023. Let's go through the front line, but before we do so, let's show you my key. So if you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please pause the video and check out the key. Right, we're going to go to the northeast sector, to Kupiansk, to Svatova, to Kremina, and actually there's not too much to report. It is an active front line. The ISW Institute for the Study of War talks about all the usual places, as I often say, but not too much to suggest any meaningful change there. It's obviously fairly active up in the northern area by Ivanivska and Kupiansk itself, that kind of area in the north, and then it's Serebiensky Forest and other places. We're going to come down to Bakhmut, where I was listening to Andrew Perpetua's live stream last night, where he's talking about how people in the area are claiming it's just incredibly active right up and down the front line, with all forms of kind of warfare, weaponry being used, aviation, artillery, mortar, small arms, fire and infantry, Gimlers, whatever, just all sorts going on. In fact, there was apparently a HIMARS strike on this building here to the southwest, of Bakhmut, the city itself. If you remember this building, by one of the main roads out of Bakhmut or into Bakhmut, which is interesting because HIMARS aren't generally used in concert with kind of maneuvers or so close to the front line. They're usually about hitting places with their added 84-kilometer distance, you know, the greater distance and range that they can get on than artillery. So, yeah, there is possibly a question as to why hitting there with HIMARS, why use that. Was it that this target required slightly heavier munition or ordnance than what they could achieve with artillery? Quite possibly. It might be that there was a large accumulation of troops there, and so that could help to explain why the Russians have lost so many troops over the last few days. I don't know. It's speculation there, but they are using, both sides are using everything they can in terms of the activity going on along the front line here. So there are some changes to the front line in favor of, again, the Russians, this time to the north of Klishchivka, where both Syriac maps and Deep State maps show the Russians have control across the railway line, again coming into the northern regions of the village of Klishchivka. There have been some claims that the Russians do control some of these most northerly, I would say buildings, but they're just rubble and basements now. But anyway, they could have a foothold there. If we look at Syriac maps here, they say the situation south of Bakhmut, the Russian army retook control over the railway section north of Klishchivka. In addition, Russian troops expelled the Ukrainian army from north of the ruins of Andriivka, while the southern part remains in the grey zone. That is quite a meaningful advance for the Russians if Syriac maps is to believe. That's to take control over half of the settlement of Andriivka and move back across the railway line. Worrying for the Ukrainians if that is the case. Andrew Perpetua not in agreement there with his mapping, and he mapped and did a live stream last night. I don't know exactly what the situation is, but it certainly appears that the Russians have shifted momentum and they now have the initiative in the area. Quite how much they're going to how many resources they're going to put into taking back territory here, I don't know, because they are fairly active elsewhere, particularly Avdiivka, of course, just to the south of here. But nonetheless, the Russians, at least according to some sources, are showing further signs of gains around Klishchivka area and Andriivka, where the Ukrainians previously were doing pretty well. And we come back down to this area by Horlivka, which is a bit of an odd one. In fact, Andrew Perpetua, again, he called into question, why here is that sensible? Horlivka is a massive, geographically large city, and it is, those defensive lines have been in place since 2014. Is this a wise use of resources, given how much trouble the Ukrainians might be in just nearby in Avdiivka, and of course what you've seen up in Bakhmut. So I don't know, you could call this into question, or it could just be fairly opportunistic. We don't know the finer details of why they are active around here, but they are making some gains. In fact, these kind of slag heaps I showed you yesterday, just in case you didn't see, I'll give you a 3D topography of the area, because actually it does give you a sense of what they're fighting over here. So the Ukrainians are now coming back from, where your position is, where your point of view is, and moving to the east and taking over some of these high pieces of ground, or at least if they're not taking over, they're pushing the Russians back. And you can see that there's a quarry there with a lake, and over here you've got a massive slag heap, sort of fairly mountainous area. This has not been accentuated at all, this topography. This is, scale to scale. So this is an interesting area, and as you push back further, it is either rolling hills, kind of undulating, or kind of mining areas that have man-made hills and topography. So certainly an interesting area for the Ukrainians to be attacking. They are having some success there, so I wouldn't wish them not to have that success, but the question might be, is this the most sensible place for them to attack? Because it might be that the Ukrainians, that the Russians, I don't know, would they be wanting to rush reserves into here? Is this something they're genuinely going to worry about? Can the Ukrainians really cause trouble by moving on? I don't know. It's sort of all open questions. And as we come down further to the south to Avdiivka, we have, as you can see, a number of changes on the maps around here, and a bit chaotic, to be perfectly honest, with regard to what Deep State Maps is saying. As you can see, some gains for the Russians, and then gains for the Ukrainians, gains for the Russians, gains for the Ukrainians, gains for the Russians. So it's all alternating around there, and then fairly hairy to the south of Krasnohorivka by the Terrakon slag heap, and then further to the south in this industrial area. This is, in my books, the biggest worry, because the Russians really are apparently moving through that industrial zone. We'll do some geolocation in a second, and that is, I think, pretty challenging for the Ukrainians, because I guess that really is knocking on the door of Avdiivka itself, the central part. As long as the Ukrainians can keep the Russians from getting into the coke plants here, and really you don't want them advancing much further from where they are presently, because you're starting to get into Avdiivka, and in my books that's kind of game over, really. I just don't think it's a viable option to hold on to that. In the same way, the question would then be, well, how much attrition are we going to achieve by doing some kind of fighting withdrawal, holding out as much as we can? But you also don't want to leave yourself vulnerable to being surrounded in a way that wasn't really ever going to happen in Bakhmut. So when you look at Bakhmut, at the time, the Russians weren't so present up here, and it was more about moving through Bakhmut. But at any one time, the Ukrainians could actually operationally, in fact, it really was just a very long operational withdrawal. They could remove themselves from Bakhmut and not get caught in any kind of operational encirclement. I think the Russians gave up on that fairly early on, in terms of, are we really going to be able to surround them? No. So by the way, Andrew Perpetua does a lot of talking about Chasiv Yar being are the Ukrainians going to end up having to defend eventually Chasiv Yar after they've culminated around Bakhmut and the Russians are pushing back? Could they push them all the way back in this northern area to the outskirts of Chasiv Yar? That would be interesting if that was the case. But back down here, the Russians have put the Ukrainians in a very different position here to Bakhmut, because actually they are in danger of being properly encircled and then having an awful lot of troops surrounded by the Russians. So we'll have to wait to see what happens there. If we look to the ISW, they say of the area, footage published on the 16th, which ISW has geolocated, indicates the Russian forces marginally advanced in the industrial zone to the south. Okay, so we've got that on the map. Russian sources claim that on the 16th and 17th, Russian forces advanced near Stepova, which we've got on the map, and one Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces control a significant portion of the settlement. That is Stepova. Russian sources also claimed on the 16th and 17th that they have advanced west of Krasnohorivka in a direction of Novokonyovo and Ocheritina, alternate, and near the waste heap. the Avdiivka coke plant, northwest of Avdiivka, and the industrial zone. So quite a lot of advancing going on. Russian Mill blogger has claimed that on the 17th, Russian forces controlled at least 60% in the industrial zone. Okay, so 60% of this industrial zone with deep state maps showing that the Russians have indeed taken control of some of that land. And then towards, towards Stepova here, and claim that actually the Russians control some of that settlement, and towards this Novobakhmativka and Ocheretny, or whatever, however you pronounce it, and towards Novokonyovi. So lots of advances for the Russians. Let's look at some of the other sources here. Well, Kiev Independent says that Russia prepares another Avdiivka offensive, so they're looking to go again properly, and I think they're in the midst of that really now. Russian forces intensified ground attacks against Avdiivka and surrounding settlements in early October in an attempt to encircle the strategic town, and they've had separate waves where the Ukrainians have exacted an awful lot of cost on the Russians, but they are using mass as a quality of its own to achieve certain goals there. Here we have the Russians active, Lancet striking a Ukrainian howitzer in a village of Umanska, which is west of Avdiivka. Let's go and see where that is. So the Russians aren't just sending their troops in and only doing things on foot. They're also using Lancet drones to hit Ukrainian artillery. In this case, it's some distance from the front line, but as well within Lancet range, to be honest. So that is from the front line about 18 kilometers. So that's a problem for the Ukrainians if the Russians are having some success in degrading Ukrainian equipment. Now, no report says Russians attack west of the railway tracks towards the entrances to Avdiivka coke plant. Yep. Additionally, attacks were reported north of Stepova. Yep. As Russians are trying to widen the bridgehead near the railway tracks, and the Ukrainians report that Russia brought in new equipment. So this idea that they are still very serious about this attack, kind of like what the Kiev Independent is saying, a third wave of Avdiivka assaulting going on, and that does include new equipment being brought to bear. When we look at a few other sources, we can see that and I was talking about Ka-52 attack helicopters this morning. Well, there's some footage of a Russian LMUR strikes on the west of Tonyanka. So this is weapons on board the attack helicopters west of Tonyanki village on the west of the Avdiivka front, and this has been geolocated to the following place. So helicopters active here, and Tonyanka, by the way, is just there, just northwest of Severny. So it's quite a key settlement for the Ukrainians to hold to stop the encirclement. Well, that strike is very close to the settlement there. So this is, again, another worry for the Ukrainians if the Russians are able to use attack helicopters that were particularly effective on the southern front. And then north of Avdiivka, this is Suret Maps' claim that towards Novokonyovi, the Russians are taking control over more land. But then you have the Ukrainians retaking that small 437 railway station. And I say station in the loosest possible sense of the word. It's not on this map at all, really. Might be there, but where it was indicated the other day on Surat Maps, it seemed like it's not on this older 2018 iteration of Google Earth. But yet, some gains for the Ukrainians in one area where they have lost in another. And then it says here that, moreover, Ukrainian troops are withdrawing towards positions within the coke plant and from some dachas southwest of Vasily. So that's Vasily is this place there that's not marked on the map, as I've mentioned before. Just here that the Ukrainians are pulling back, and Deep State Map has those gains there. So Deep State Map, just to give you a sense of what's happened over the last 24 hours, gives you the changes over time. So this is what we have seen over the last 2 days. So 15th, 16th, a little bit towards basically around the coke plant there. And then again, you can see this is the last 24 hours. So quite a bit of change up here, a bit of to and fro in that kind of area. But generally elsewhere, the Ukrainians are gaining, the Russians are gaining territory. There, quite a significant bit of territory because that's important industrial infrastructure. And then around here, generally moving into Ukrainian territory there. So it's certainly troubling for the Ukrainians around Avdiivka. Nothing dissimilar to what I've said previously. And then we can go down from there, get rid of that pin, to Mariinka, and we have a claim that the Ukrainians have ceded some ground to the Russians here. The Russians have managed to take another block of town in the former city of Mariinka. Now, I don't know what that says in terms of what the mappers here have. If you look there, it is, I think, it's what Direct Maps already had under Russian control. So it may be just a rejig for Global War Monitor in terms of what Surat Maps has. That's this block there. Andrew Perpetua doesn't agree with that, but arguably these kind of areas are generally grey zones anyway. Right, let's move on from here and out further to the south. There is activity around Novomerkulivka. Claims that the Russians are sending up troops that have been a long time in the making. These are troops that have apparently been training for the best part of a year, as according to Andrew Perpetua. And there are claims that they have been moving from Berdyansk sort of area up here to Mariupol and then further to the north, with a possibility that they are sending fresh troops to go and attack Vuhledar. But the question then would be, well, what are you doing that for? Have you not seen what's happened to Vuhledar previously? That seems to be rather a futile attempt and possibly not a good use of troops. That is not to say they're definitely going there, however. It could be that they are gathering these troops. They have been training much further to the north, I believe, in the Luhansk Oblast. But anyway, from both Berdyansk and Mariupol, where they're presently stationed, these guys haven't been used in active combat duties so far. It could be that they're going to Mikilska. That is one theory in Vuhledar. It could be that they're going to Avdiivka or even to Bakhmut, or all of the above. So one might hope, if you're pro-Ukrainian, that they have a good handle on where those convoys are, and that if they could hit them, that will be obviously very advantageous for the Ukrainians. But this again possibly talks to the idea that Russians have more reserves than we've been giving them credit for having. Certainly, I think they're low on reserves, and I still do. It's just they have consistent mobilization that takes place. When you're gaining thousands and thousands of troops every month, tens of thousands of troops, arguably, you are able to create reserves. They might not be the best reserves, but they are boots on the ground that can be used in meat assaults or to throw into trenches to defend. But then there are probably these units that are being kept by for some kind of big assault. But as they were talking about in Andrew Perpetua's live stream last night, why would you wait a year, train these troops up, and then just send them into Vuhledar? I mean, if you were those troops, you'd be thinking, really? I've heard about this place. I'm not too sure about that. You sure you want to send me there? Yeah. No, it'd be fine. Yeah, not so sure. Then we're going to come to potential gains for, well, as a geolocation, potential gains for the Russians around the Velika Novosilka salient. Geolocated footage published on the 16th indicates that Russian forces advance east of Uruzhaini, which is a bit of a worry. Here we have repelling an enemy assault east of the village of Uruzhaini. So the Russians appear to be attacking here. See what that turns up. Right, so that is to the east of Uruzhani. That's in that kind of salient that Direct Maps has the Russians having control over, including whatever that area is there. So I don't know that that does signify a gain, or at least it depends what mapper you're looking at. So Andrea Perpetua doesn't have that under Russian control. Direct Maps has that under Russian control, and that activity is taking place within Russian-controlled area. But then, if that is under Russian control, how are you repelling an assault there? You would expect the assault to be in the grey zone. So that probably indicates that Andrea Perpetua, the map that he has, is more accurate, and that they are attacking in a given direction and moving into the grey zone or towards the Ukrainian-controlled territory. So that probably is accurate for the ISW. Claim that, and then geolocated footage, or at least to report the claim. Geolocated footage published on the 16th shows that Ukrainian forces repelling a Russian assault west of Novodonetsk, and this is just over here. So that could be the same sort of place. I don't know if actually. So that is 63 and 61. We'll go and check that out then. Okay, the geolocation to that, talking about Russians getting hit there by Ukrainians, Russians getting screwed again, it says there, is in this position. I don't know that I can. I'm going to have to go to a separate map to geolocate this. So that is there. We'll put that into my Google Earth. And here we have. We'll see if it's a separate one or not. I like that, does it? Oh no, yeah. So that is a separate attack. So the Russians in that position as well as in that position getting hit by the Ukrainians, which means they are active in that sector. They are trying to push the Ukrainians back, and that is something else the Ukrainians have to think about. So it does seem, as I've said over the last few days, that the Russians are pushing in a number of different areas. Now, when we come to Robotina, we have Deep State Map having some gains for the Russians in an area where the Ukrainians had made some of their own gains previously. So north of Verbove, that shows that the Russians are doing what the Russians do, which is as soon as they see some land to the Ukrainians, they'll put a counterattack in place and try and take that back. The ISW of this general area of the Robotina area, don't mind me scrolling there, says that Ukrainian forces continue counteroffensive operations. There are geolocated footage published on the 16th indicating Ukrainian forces marginally advancing southwest of Robotina, so slightly different area. That is here. Russian shelling of Ukrainians. Let's see if we can see some advances for the Ukrainians here. And that suggests, no, it doesn't suggest anything. What I'm doing with my hands here. There we go. There are Ukrainians present in that area. That's what you'd expect if you were attacking in the grey zone, moving towards the Russian front line. But that is very close to all of the mappers' ideas of where the front lines are. So that's, I wouldn't say that indicates that the Ukrainians control that land, but they are attacking there and they are present at that point. And if the Russians are shelling them, I don't know if it means that they are in position there, or in dugouts there, or whether that is a moving attack. According to NORA reports, geolocated footage confirms the area under Ukrainian control east of Kopani has grown. So this is a more positive outlook for the Ukrainians as far as NORA reports is concerned. The area just here, but more of this space there is under Ukrainian control than some of these mappers are giving them credit for. The AFU is conducting offensive operations west of Robotina and east of Kopani, simultaneously trying to get control over important trench networks and heights. They're very active around there. There could be some success for the Ukrainians, although my mappers don't show that. And there might well be some success for the Russians north of Verbove, which would be a shame for the Ukrainians because, you fight hard to take these places and then you quickly change hands, don't they? Anyway, coming on to the final sector, which is the Kherson River, or the Dnipro River in Kherson Oblast, and we can see that there are no changes to the maps, but there's quite a lot of conversation to be had about this area as ever. The Russians, I think, are trying to put in defenses as much as they can, throwing resources to the area. There are claims that the Ukrainians have some 3 brigades or elements of 3 brigades across the river in different places. There are claims that they are still getting light equipment across. The Russians might be struggling here because of the geography of, like, there aren't too many options in terms of getting troops in and out. You've got these sands in the way, so you're going to have to rely on these roads that are potentially interdicted or under fire control in certain areas. Otherwise, it's these smaller roads up here, which, they are in the hands of the Ukrainians in certain areas. So it's difficult for the Russians. But I think, as we haven't seen too much exchange of territory in the last few days, I think the Russians have probably stabilized it to some degree. But there are various claims about what's going on. No report says no confirmed map changes. Russians are bringing in troops near the M14 highway. So that's that larger road I was showing you here, this yellow one that you can see. They are bringing supplies as well. Multiple videos have emerged showing Ukrainian first-person view drones hitting Russian supply trucks and vehicles, and the Ukrainian Marines have confirmed their presence on the left bank. So there is a lot of activity with a lot of different units. There's also an awful lot of drone activity in the area, not just from the Ukrainians. I'll show you some Russian drone activity as well. So we have a TOS-1, the TOS-1 that I mentioned, I think, this morning in the first video I did. Destruction footage yesterday. Deep State says it was destroyed in Krinky. This bitch was brought up to shell the defender positions on the left bank, says Dmitry. There was footage. Now it's no more after meeting with the apparently Baba Yaga agri drone. So this here, and you can see it on the side of the road there, this has been geolocated to very close to Krinky. These thermobaric launchers don't have great range. They've only got a sort of 6-kilometer range in reality. So when they're used, they are pretty vulnerable. This one, I believe, it doesn't have the geolocation there. Let's see if I can find it. It shows you on the map in that video, but I like to get a good set of coordinates to show where that is. And here it is. So it's pretty much on that road. In the video, you can see them driving past the destroyed remnants of it. And that is pretty close because it needs to be close in order to do the damage it does. See how far from, say, Krinky that is. That is your 5, but that is your 6 kilometers. And so that's why it was that close. And being that close, it means it's very, very vulnerable to drone and artillery fire. And it is no more. And that's going to be really good news because that was causing quite some damage to the Ukrainians in Krinky, and you can't imagine that they'll be able to get another TOS-1 there. Sweet, in the next day. It takes some time to get that brought from somewhere else, I would have thought. So that's good for the Ukrainians. However, the Ukrainians themselves have potentially, although I don't know what the damage here is, when you see these bits of video and then they cut out pretty much as soon as the drone explodes, you're left thinking, well, did that really do much damage? I mean, here's a Lancet, which notoriously are variable in the amount of damage they do. But what's significant here is it's hitting the PTS-2 landing ship, which you can imagine is probably pretty high value, and the equipment on board. So here it is near, on the Dnipro Delta, close by to the activity. And then, it's got the equipment on board. It's just, I presume, in the middle of doing its thing. And then it gets hit by the Lancet. I won't show you that. I mean, all you see is from a distance, just a white puff of smoke. And then it cuts out. So we don't know what the damage is to that. But it is obviously going to be a shame for the Ukrainians to lose a bit of kit like that. That is near Krinky. And then we have other activity taking place around the area. So this is Askania Nova, Occupy Kherson, where a Russian base has been destroyed. And that will obviously hurt the Russians quite a lot. They are suffering in terms of personnel losses we've seen over the last 3 to 4 days. And there are some speculation that the Ukrainians have been successful in taking out troop accumulations such as these. Here, yeah, there's a big. They should also take down what I suspect is a communication tower. Says this source, looking at the communication tower next to that base. And then we have this, according to Russian sources, the Desert Cross 1003 TUV is already in Krinky. This would be a perfect small vehicle that could be brought across fairly easily, you would have thought, by the Ukrainians. Be very light, comparatively speaking. And so the Ukrainians are being reported to have got across various bits of equipment. It's going to be so important that they continue to do that. They need to establish this bridgehead, particularly in Krinky, where, as you can see, they're struggling to get control over the southwestern and the northeastern extent of the town, of the village of Krinky, as it goes into Kazachi Lahiri and up into Korsunka. I've heard less about Pischanivka, Poima, and Pidstepny, but one can assume that activity is still taking place there. The ISW says of the area, says quite a lot, that there's ongoing operations there, and ongoing battles near Poima, Pischanivka, and Krinky. Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces maintain positions in central Krinky and that they controlled 10 square kilometers of territory near Krinky as of November the 16th. Another Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces were engaged in attritional fighting near Krinky, and yesterday that several small Ukrainian river crossing attempts along the Poima-Krinky line have taken place, and that Ukrainian forces are struggling to transfer equipment and personnel to Ukrainian positions on the East Bank. Now, that could well be true. It's going to be difficult to do that. And when you've got Lancet drones still operational, we talked about how electronic warfare is prevalent in the area, but there's still, it's you can have operational electronic warfare, and it's going to be dynamic. It's going to be changing. And there'll be days or hours when the Russians will be able to use their equipment and do all sorts of damage with it. There are lots of fundraising projects for different units at the moment in the area. It's interesting when you go through these different phases of the war, you see, right, we're raising money for drones, we're raising money for tourniquets, we're raising money for this, we're raising money for SUVs. At the moment, it's outboard motors, and a number of units in the Kherson region are raising money for outboard motors. Now, you would think that, and Andrew Perpetua's live stream, they discussed this on that last night, you'd think that a nation could surely, when you're providing, say, Nazam's worth X million spondulis, you're thinking, well, you could provide 100 boats. Just there you go, 100 small riverine boats or something. You don't have to be military grade, just commercial ones. Get troops across. They don't need big patrol boats, which they do have a number of, but they're not going to use those to just ferry troops across the river. They're just dinghies with outboards and stuff like that to get light equipment and humans across and medevac injured the other way. So it's really important that they have the requisite equipment, and it seems that they're running low on boats and outboard motors. So anyway, that's what's going on in that area. Just to finish the ISW, I guess, Russian insider claimed that elements of the 35th Motorized Rifle Brigade suffered heavy losses from Ukrainian artillery fire on November the 10th in Holopristan. So I don't know if I remember that particularly happening, but that's further down the river here, Holopristan. Very active kind of area, really. Reported increase in the size of the Ukrainian grouping on the eastern bank in recent weeks suggests that Russian interdiction efforts along the Dnipro River have not prevented the Ukrainian forces from transferring additional personnel and material to these positions. I think it's going to be difficult for the Ukrainians, but this is certainly somewhere where they could potentially have some really good success. But obviously the Russians will know that as well, and they are piling in some defensive resources there. But of course, like I said, the last few days, are they robbing Peter to pay Paul? It appears that they have taken units and resources from the Robotina area and are bringing them down to the Kherson Oblast. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care, and I'll speak to you tomorrow.